We'll get into things. So tēnā koutou katoa, no mai hara mai, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Raising Sporty Daughters. I call Kylie Curr and I'm going to be your host for this evening. I'd like to start us off with our Sport New Zealand karakia, and this karakia is about bringing us together and settling us into tonight's kaupapa. So te taua mai I runga, te taua mai I raro, te taua mai I roto, te taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te mauri tū, kia tau ai te mauri ora, tūtū whakamaua kia tīna, haumie, huie, tākie. Kia ora everybody. Wonderful to have so many of you online joining us for this kōrero. Welcome to our New Zealand audiences. Welcome to anyone that's dialing in from overseas. I'm especially excited about tonight's session, and I'm sure that you will get a lot from our wonderful special guest, Kylie Cox. So tonight's webinar is going to focus on raising active teenage girls. We're going to talk through the importance of proper fueling. We're going to talk through about recovery, around having courageous conversations with coaches and sport leaders, as well as the connection between menstruation and physical activity. And so this webinar supports Balance is Better, which is Sport New Zealand's philosophy for youth sport. And hopefully many of you will have heard about Balance is Better. You've obviously been able to sign up through the website. But for those who haven't, Balance is Better is our national framework for youth sport. It's about ensuring all young people receive a quality sporting experience regardless of needs or motivations. It's about keeping our kids in sport, getting them to grow, have a lifelong love of being active and doing whatever they may be able to do within their sporting lives. And we all play a role here, whether we're sports administrators, whether we're coaches, and particularly important for our kōrero tonight are our parents and whānau. So before I introduce our lovely special guest and we get into the conversation, just a couple of housekeeping things. So we will be running some live polls tonight, so please watch out for these to pop up, and it will be great to have you interacting with these. If you have any questions, please pop these into the chat function, and if you haven't found it, it's on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the night, and we'll do our very best to get to as many questions as possible throughout the conversation. Just a few obvious kind of guidelines on this. Please keep your questions to tonight's topic, and we can make the most of our time here with Kylie. And please keep comments and questions positive and constructive. To test out the chat function, if you haven't already, drop your name and where you're from into that chat. I've lots and lots of you online already. Kia ora from Taumaranui. Hastings Pony Club, welcome. If you have any technical issues with the video, just close the window, come back in on the link that the same link that you came in on before. If issues still persist, please contact Hamish, who is in the background, and he'll be using the email address that you received the link on. It is my absolute pleasure now to introduce our wonderful presenter for this evening. So Kylie is a physiotherapist with a postgraduate qualification in sport medicine and sport science. Kylie's special interests is in female athlete, and in particular in adolescent and young women's sport and active recreation. Kylie works as a performance physio in Christchurch and is a team physiotherapist with Mainland's National Netball League and the New Zealand Secondary Schools netball teams. As Director of Healthy Athlete Project, Kylie provides education on female athletic health to schools, clubs and sporting organisations, both regionally and nationally. Her goal is to work with athletes, coaches, whānau and support staff to improve the awareness of female health-related issues and promoting best practice support of the female athlete. So Kylie, kia ora, welcome. It is wonderful to have you here tonight.
Kia ora, Kelly. Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
So look, tonight's conversation, we're going to explore, there's lots, and so I'm going to stop talking really, really quickly, really soon. So tonight's conversation, we're going to sort of start off on that, how female athletes are different. We're going to talk around the menstrual cycle and physical activity, the importance of fueling in active teenage girls, loading, recovery, and of course those courageous conversations with those sports leaders. As I said, do pop your questions into the chat and we'll try and get through to those as much as we can. But to help us understand who we've got on the call tonight, we're going to have two polls that jump up for you now. So the polls are live. The first one is, so what role do you play in youth sport? So which hat are you predominantly wearing? So are you here tonight with your parents' hat on, with your coach's hat on, with your administrator's hat on? Or the other one I like is the other, which is always a really interesting one. And then the second poll, which has hopefully popped up for you as well, is what age or ages of the daughters or younger women that you're supporting? So under 12s, 13 to 15s, and 16 plus years. So just having a look at some of those, that 13 to 15 years, Kylie, seems to be where the majority of our crew are at tonight.
Okay.
So to get us going and to start us off, I wonder if you just would do a bit of a set the scene for us around how are young female athletes different, and what, and sort of kind of set the tone for this evening.
Yeah, okay. So I think, there's been a lot of recent developments in this space, and it's only really in the last few years that it's coming into the forefront of sports science, I guess. And for the main part, the reason for that has been that historically, a lot of the sports science research has been done on young, active males, white males in the 18 to 24 age group. And there's this thought now that obviously we can't extrapolate some of that data out and just apply it to females just because of so many differences. And I guess the question is, well, are young female athletes, are they really that different? And my point really is that yes, they are, and obviously with a lot of researchers in this space. And the reason for that predominantly is that we are so unique in the fact that we have a menstrual cycle, and with the menstrual cycle, we also have an endocrine system, which is the glands and the organs that produce hormones that then act on the body systems, and that's highly sensitive because of the cyclical and individual natures of the hormones produced. So we definitely have that, and we have those cyclical hormones that the male species don't have. They have more of a baseline pattern of testosterone. So that's the biggest number one underlying physiological factor. And I guess what I'm really passionate about is trying to get people to understand that the menstrual cycle is actually really important for health, and trying to re-educate or change the discourse really around the fact that that is the case, and we really want it as a really good health marker, and we're going to talk about that. We know that our young females, they change and then therefore move really differently during puberty. So there's a lot of pubertal changes in early puberty and early adolescence, and that impacts the way females move. It impacts the way they see themselves in the sports space. It influences their relationship with activity, and we know from our research, and Sport New Zealand has a good resource on this, is we know that there's this big dropout rate in our sort of around the 14-year-old mark. And so we know that there's work to be done on how we keep our young females in sport, really. Young females and female athletes in general have a different injury profile. They have different injury risks, and we have different challenges with respect to injury. And predominantly, you'll see a lot of that with regards to bone health. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. And also we have some higher proportion of big injuries like ACL and ligamentous injuries. And there is some research being done into that as to whether there's an underlying physiological factor for that. And we're not going to go into that tonight, but just to know that this is just another reason why females need to be researched differently, they need to be treated differently, and they need to be thought of differently. And also, just as I touched on before, females respond differently socially and emotionally in and out of sports. So they quite often, in terms of coaching and parenting, they like to know the why. They like to be a bit more involved in the process of coaching, whereas sometimes with males, there's a bit more of being able to be just told what to do. And so we know that there's a little bit of difference there. So that's kind of the gist. And that's, oh, geez, hang on a sec, yeah, so that's the first bit, just the top bit there. But when we talk about all those physiological and environmental factors, however, when we're talking about sport and we're talking about training, we need to just be aware that the big rocks of training are the same between both sexes. So we always need to have an adequate and appropriate training stimulus. We're really focused on the nutrition and we're focused on the recovery. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is just a little bit about how that plays out in terms of the female athlete. Just having touched on a few things, so we know that puberty is set off in the brain, so there's a signal there that gets the ball rolling, so to speak, and that starts off with some of the really early pubertal changes like breast budding, and then into pubic hair. But then we start to get a build in these sex hormones that are produced, and most noticeably in and around ovarian hormones, and that's what starts off the whole process of menstruation. We know that female athletes, they have a growth spurt a lot quicker earlier on than males. So about 2 years earlier than their counterparts, they are starting to grow taller. And so after about the age of 8, when puberty onset can kind of begin, we start to see those differences in the playground between girls and boys and females and males. And so our females grow taller, but what's really important, and when we come down to loading, what's really important to realize is that as those bones grow longer and taller, they don't necessarily get stronger at the same rate.
Yeah.
And so with our female athletes, one of the really key elements that we need to be aware of, and as physios we're really focused on, is this principle of growing bone mineral density and achieving that peak bone strength that we want. And the key time for that is during adolescence and throughout puberty. And that's why we want to be really aware of the things we're going to talk about tonight, like fueling and loading and recovery, because essentially that we are trying to get those really fundamental processes laid down in those adolescent years. And then obviously we've got the menstrual cycle, and in New Zealand we're looking at an age bracket of around about 13 years of age, and so we're going to now just have a wee bit of a chat about that. Again, when we look at the historical kind of conversations that have happened around the menstrual cycle and where it's been brought in the education system, is there's still just been a really big push on the menstrual cycle as a means of looking at reproduction. And so where I'm really passionate is to try and, especially in our younger age bracket, is to try and move away from that conversation and actually just to teach them about what the menstrual cycle is at the very basic level and how it's so important and interrelated with their health. And the same for parents, just really getting some good understanding of why the hormone production is so important and how it influences the rest of the body systems. And because it influences almost every body system, it's going to inadvertently impact performance and health. So yeah, that's the big thing. So we're going to just talk a little bit about the menstrual cycle now, just some really basics about what I want people to kind of understand with respects to health and why it's so important to keep an eye on this with your young girls and to be involved and to be continually kind of just touching base on that. And then we're going to just briefly talk about couple of things that can change the menstrual cycle and what you want to be aware of, and then we'll go a little bit further down the track a little bit later on.
Cool.
So the most important thing, I guess, to realize about the menstrual cycle when we're talking about health is that the main event of a natural menstrual cycle is this process of ovulation. Now, as I said, historically, it's been taught around ovulation as growing the follicles that can release an egg that can then be fertilized, which obviously may or may not turns into a pregnancy. But we're not, I don't go around talking about that at school. What I essentially want to talk about is that we cannot produce the sex hormones from the ovaries without ovulation. So if we have periods or if we have menstrual cycles that are not having an ovulatory process, and we can talk about what changes that, then we're not really getting that hormone production. The hormone production that we need in females is obviously estrogen and progesterone. they work in tandem. They're kind of a yin and a yang. So one is thought of as a bit of an anabolic kind of hormone, which builds things up, and one is thought of as a bit of a catabolic, which breaks things down. But they need to work in unison. However, when we're talking about tonight, we're going to talk a lot about estrogen and just how that plays its part in the musculoskeletal system and in our young females. So what I'm going to the thing is that these hormones that we produce, estrogen and progesterone, they're really vital for our female health. They play a massive role. They play a role from anything to do with brain, cognition, mood. They also impact bone and soft tissue. They work on your digestive system. They obviously factor in with the growth hormones and get you bigger and stronger. So they're really important. And I guess the thing is that I don't think any of us, and maybe people on this call tonight who are sort of my age or that bracket, I don't think we really got that message when we were growing up. We sort of it kind of missed a step that it was actually really important for us for future health. And I guess the other thing to know is with your teenagers is to be aware that this ovulation is actually money in the bank. So every time a young female has a menstrual cycle that ovulates, they are putting money in the bank of their bone health. They're putting money in the bank of their soft tissue. They're putting money in the bank for their brain and their metabolic rate and how they function. So it's actually super important and super exciting. But, we've got some things that can alter that. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, I haven't got a slide for this, but I guess there's a couple of things just to touch on. And then what I want to summarize is just to give parents a couple of key messages, because we don't have all the time in the world to go down this track. And I know that people, sometimes the menstrual cycle gets a little bit, maybe now people are a little bit at times sick of hearing about it. But I think if you can take one message out of tonight, it's actually that it builds health, and then health builds performance. So we really want it. The things that can kind of alter the menstrual cycle is, and I know that a lot of people in this talk tonight have suggested they've got females around that 13 to 15 years of age. So the thing to be aware of in that age bracket is obviously, for the most part, a lot of those young females will be at the start of their menstrual cycle journey or their menstrual cycle history. And so the onset of menstruation at maybe around that 13 years of age can make the menstrual cycle a little bit irregular. And so usually what we will say is that we want a menstrual cycle that's about 21 to 35 days. So that's from day one of one period to day one of the next period. But in teenagers, it is common for it to be up in and around the 45, out to 45 days.
Wow.
And that can last for several years, like maybe 18 months to 3 years. The thing is, most individuals will kind of regulate, but it's just having that in the back of your mind, but also being aware, as we talk about further, that we want the menstrual cycle to be nice and regular. So if that persists for a period of time, that you may just want to go and get a health assessment on that. So age is one thing, and many of the females on this will also know that at the other end of the scale, when we get to sort of late 40s, we get another change of irregular cycles as we go through what's termed our second puberty, which is perimenopause. It's a whole nother topic.
Let's not go down that road just yet.
Yeah. We're also going to talk a little bit tonight about a concept called low energy availability, and that's essentially around the available energy that the body has after we take away exercise to fuel all the body systems. And having low energy availability to fuel your body system can impact the menstrual cycle, because one of the body systems that can get down regulated if we're not eating enough food or we're not bringing enough energy from food is the menstrual cycle. And so that is why we call the menstrual cycle a monthly report card, because it is one factor that you can kind of be able to monitor quite easily around whether you're getting enough nutrition in the body. So a nice regular menstrual cycle often, but not always, can mean that we've got enough energy coming in. one of the most obvious reasons that the menstrual cycle stops or becomes irregular, but more likely stops, is obviously pregnancy. That's always something to be in the back of your mind when you're a parent of of probably an older teenager who's become sexually active. So that's one thing. And the other really big thing, and this always causes a lot of conversation and something we might be able to touch on, but probably not go into too deeply, is the impact of hormonal contraception on the menstrual cycle. So we know that it's still really common and for young females to go on some form of hormonal contraception through their teenage years. And I will just kind of recap why it's important, but essentially most hormonal contraceptions work on the process of down-regulating or abolishing ovulation. And that's how they work to stop people getting pregnant. Now, when we talked about ovulation being the key event of the menstrual cycle in terms of producing hormones and therefore supporting health, we've got a bit of a mismatch there between hormonal contraception and its continued widespread use and just this other research that's coming through around how important it is to ovulate. So I guess
I've just got a quick question here because it's right on topic, and so we've got a really question in here from one of the participants. Is going, how can we tell if our girls are having a good cycle and producing ovulation? So are there any telltale signs or?
Yeah, so the first, the most obvious thing is to know if they're on hormonal contraception. Like obviously we've got a large cohort here who's 13 to 15. So, I don't know, I'm not there yet, but the most obvious thing is to know whether they're on some form of hormonal contraception. And if the answer to that is yes, it's having an awareness of what it is and how it works on the body. Okay. So if that hormonal contraception works on the body to prevent pregnancy by down-regulating or stopping ovulation, you probably won't have an ovulatory cycle. The other thing is if you have a natural cycle, so you're not having any other medication that can interfere with that or hormonal contraception, then the way that you should know that you're ovulating is one through cervical mucus, which or cervical fluid, which you can look up the signs of ovulation. Also, a nice regular healthy period with bleeding. And if you are concerned around whether there is ovulation, there are some other tests that you can done and have done with your GP. But essentially, you are unlikely to ovulate if you're on hormonal contraception. There are some forms of contraception that allow ovulation, and therefore that's why it's really important to know which ones is which.
Amazing, yeah. Thank you.
So I guess that, just the four sort of key messages for parents and anyone who has a teenage daughter or works closely with them or supports them is really the questions around the menstrual cycle are, is it present for a start? Do they have one, and is it regular? I guess the fact for that would be, is it natural or is it a hormonal cycle, a hormonal contraception affected menstrual cycle, which means that it's actually not it's actually a withdrawal bleed, so it's not a true period, and that is another topic. Is it healthy? So is it within these normal guidelines that we kind of see? And for that, it's really the age. So has the onset of the first period come before they're in and around 15? If they get to 16, we know that that's delayed onset of menarche. And that we want menstrual cycles to be not excessively heavy in terms of blood loss, and they shouldn't be so painful that young people are missing school or sport or social interactions. So that's what we mean by within normal guidelines. And then with that, it's just knowing if they need further support or assistance, so medical intervention.
Yeah, and so look, there's a couple of questions that have come through, and there's a couple of questions that we've seen through some of the chat. That are asking some of those questions, like not sure if it's normal or where there's extreme, or heavy bleeding or, those kind of things. extreme fatigue, nausea, that sort of stuff, the conversation is then, hey, look, maybe there's a need to go and talk to your GP or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, I think the general, my general advice around that is, we all know, in most of the research, it is universal that we will all develop or experience some symptoms that come with the menstrual cycle. But what we want in young females is that they are able to manage those with either over-the-counter medication, so some Panadol or ibuprofen. Now, just as an aside, ibuprofen is actually reasonably helpful in the PMS phase, because the menstrual cycle is actually a really inflammatory process. So that, but we want them to be able to manage it with simple remedies. If it's getting to the point where they're having to change period products more than sort of 2 to 3 hourly, if they're getting big blood clots, if it's painful, if it's keeping them in and away, out of school, out of sport, then that is something we want people to get checked. It is not something they should be living through, and we want to exclude medical reasons for that happening.
Yeah, cool.
With regards to fatigue, there could be some other things going on, and we might touch on that a little bit later.
Yeah, amazing. So those are kind of some of the key questions. And I think reading through some of the chat, I think we'll get to some of those other things as we go through.
Yeah.
Do we want to jump into the next poll now? Yeah, let's go there. So there should be a poll that comes up for you. And this is just about understanding how active your girls are. So hopefully that has popped up, and give you a minute to take a drink there, Kylie. Doing amazing. Sorry. No, you're doing amazing. So the question is, how active are you? So once or twice a week, 3 to 4 times a week, or over 5 times a week. And looking at this kind of 65% are sort of over 5 activities a week. So we've got some girls here that are really active. And so I think going into these next few bits is going to be some really cool information for everybody. Awesome. I'll head back to you, Kylie. So importance of fueling.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about fueling, and just why it's so important, I guess. So just looking at that poll and talking about the activity levels of young females, I think the important thing, a couple of upfront important things to note is, we will talk about how exercise, the amount of exercise and the type of exercise is really relative to the stage of maturation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in loading. When we talk about sort of the balance is better concept, we really like kids to be, and young females to be, trying lots of different things. And in actual fact, the amount of exercise in some children who are developed or a little bit later down the pubertal spectrum, if you like, it's not always about the amount of exercise that they're doing. It's about that level of exercise being fueled adequately and appropriately. So there is very little research to suggest that it's exercise alone that causes problems. It's exercise that is not supported in the most part by the fueling that it requires. So that's what we're going to talk about. The reason for this is that adolescence and puberty is a really, really, really big time for energy demands. And that is because one, your musculoskeletal system is developing. So we know that we've got growth, we've got bone length, we've got bone density, we've got lean muscle mass, we've got all of those things that are happening to the musculoskeletal system. And the musculoskeletal system develops and matures just like other tissue. We've also got the development and the maturation of this reproductive system, of the endocrine system. So just because you get your period doesn't mean that that is a mature reproductive system. So that continues to grow and mature, as does many other things. And then with adolescents, we've got this huge demand on their time. You know, they've got school, they've got homework, some have part-time jobs, some have 1 to 2 trainings a day. Then they've got, they've got their growth and development, and they've got their social life. So when you look at this slide, it's everything on the right-hand side is everything that we need to fuel for, and that's called the total energy demands. So I think when we're looking at this concept of energy it's this concept that we need to change the way we're thinking about fueling. We need to fuel for life, and that's one of the things we talk about, and I talk about a lot in my presentations. It's fueling for everything. If you have a look on the right-hand side, you'll see 2 little people with this red circle, and that's really just a symbol of physiological function. That means the bare minimum energy that you need for your body to just stay alive. And that's things like just keeping tissue growth happening, cardiovascular system, heart and lungs, cognition. So that's your bare minimum. And then you've got all those extra things on top of that. And what tends to happen is we see a lot of young females, young people, recreational athletes and elite athletes just getting into this low energy availability. And that's when you take away the energy that you put out through movement, what you eat minus what you do is still not enough to supply energy to all of the systems and all of the activities that you're doing. And the best way to kind of show this is if you are all out there and you have a pen and a paper, if you look to the right and you think that what you need for your total energy demands, let's say that equals 2,000 units of energy. So if you wrote it, it's basically when I take it to the schools, I say this is algebra. This is why algebra is so important that you need to learn. So if you put a 2,000 on the right-hand column, then let's say that you used 700 of it to do your movement during the day. So your netball practice and your weights training. Then you would at least need to eat 2,700 units of energy for that to be balanced. Yeah. And what we find is, and throughout all of the literature, and obviously that's why I'm here, is that we find that people don't put enough energy in. So they might only be eating 1,500 energy units. They take away 700 and they're left with way less than they need to fuel the systems that they've got. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to skip on to that one. And so why this is you can see why it's a problem, but the concept, what we want to look at is how does it happen, and I think the biggest reason it happens is because for the most part, we just don't understand. We just haven't understood how much the body needs and how much our adolescents are doing, and that all of that requires food. So we can't just think about movement. We have to think about life, if you like. So this concept of low energy availability happens for a number of reasons. One is due to underfueling. So that's the most common one, obviously, that we've not got enough energy in. Now, that can happen either intentionally or unintentionally. So if we intentionally underfuel, that's where we get these processes around dieting or disordered eating behavior, skipping meals, only rewarding with food when there's enough activity done. So that's more of those intentional reasons. Unintentional is just what I talked about in terms of the fact that we just don't really understand, or we don't have the knowledge, and also that we're not planning enough, we're not planning forward enough, we're not prepared enough. We know that kids and parents are super busy, often running out the door. But what I guess the education that we're trying to raise is that there does require quite a bit of prep and quite a bit of planning to support our young females. The other reason that low energy availability happens, if we look at the algebra equation, is that we have too much energy out. So energy out can either be that we're doing a lot of physical activity and maybe this concept of overtraining, but more importantly, a concept of under recovery. So under recovery is when you put more energy out than you're kind of replacing, if you like. So overtraining actually in the literature now is becoming less of an issue as under recovery and under fueling. So they're the two big ones. And so those can all happen intentionally or unintentionally. So if we think about this concept of under recovery, intentionally would be things like athletes not using rest days, not being able to switch off from sport, going from one activity to another, and then their parents maybe getting them up the next day to go for a family walk, and then we've got to go to Nana's, and then we've got to do, so it's this concept of just not having, intentionally not having enough recovery. And unintentionally is often when the athlete, when it's being done to them. So sometimes coaches putting in extra training sessions. We've got a tournament coming. We need to, do more. We need to have an extra skills session, all of those things. So everything can kind of happen, purposely or unpurposely or unintentionally, but regardless, we're left with the same sort of problem.
Yeah, cool.
And I guess this slide maybe just helps to kind of just showcase, and and like I say, I need to do a disclaimer here. I am not a nutritionist, and this slide was done in conjunction with my own nutritionist support at the time when I was training. So it's just a little bit of an idea for parents and your daughters, if they're watching or they're going to watch, of just how much that fueling is. And the premise around the fact that timing matters. So when you eat your snacks and when you have your meals in and around your activity is actually really important. So timing is very important. The type of food is important, but we want kids to be eating from a wide variety of food groups, but essentially we definitely want to have carbohydrate intake. There's recent studies that's showing it's more about the level of carbs that females are having rather than the content of calories themselves. So that's really important. And we want protein after exercise to just rebuild and resynthesize. So you guys can have a wee bit of a look at this, but it's looking at kids, and it's not unusual for them to be doing like a strength or conditioning session in the morning and then a training session in the afternoon. And so this is just a little bit of an idea of just kind of maybe not exactly like this, but the type of preparation and planning that it does take, and the amount of food that sometimes we need to give these young females just to support this energy balance that we want. And so I hear parents talk a lot about, kids eating them out of house and home, and, especially in your young females, I think more than our male counterparts, because I think for males, it's always been deemed to be quite acceptable to be eating that amount of food. But actually, if your female's eating a lot of food and they're doing a lot of sport and they're eating the right kind of things, obviously, then you should be really proud. They're doing the right things.
And so for everyone on the call, like the slide deck and the recording will be made available, so you can dive in a little bit more into some of the detail of the slides that have got lots of content on it and stuff too, right?
Yeah, and I think just to finish this little bit off, and I know we're not going to go down this track again, but it does appear that being in low energy availability for as little as 3 to 5 days is enough to start to impact the body system. So what happens next is that if anyone, whether they be, a child, a recreational athlete, elite, if they stay in this period of energy deficit for a period of time, the body is a smart little process, and it's going to start to think about how it can conserve energy to A, keep the body alive and ticking, and B, it will always prioritize movement. So it's going to try and conserve energy from other areas. And this is where we get some definite down regulation in the hormones that support other body systems. And so for the female athlete, one of the most important ones we're obviously focused on is whether the menstrual cycle is affected. So the body can, in some cases and not always, can say, well, this process of reproduction is really a want, not a need. We don't think that the body could handle it. We don't think you need to have a baby. So we're going to down-regulate that, and we're going to take some of that energy into what we're prioritizing, staying alive and movement. And so that's where we get this, some of these issues in female athletes around losing their menstrual cycle or their menstrual cycle becoming really irregular.
So some of the comments, some of the questions that are coming through, we're also talking about loading. And so I think that's sort of that next part of what we're going into. And so some of those, what does good loading look like? How many hours, or how do we know that we're balanced as well?
Yeah, sure. And the more I've looked into this week for the webinar, I think possibly the more confusing it gets. But I'm just going to try and point out, this little subtitle here is that the capacity of an athlete to load is actually dependent on their hormone networks and their maturation stage. So the answer, like with lots of things, it depends.
It depends.
So this slide is, we talk about loading, and on the left, we obviously have the type of load, the intensity and the frequency. Now, if we're talking about young female athletes, if we're talking about children who are in this kind of prepubescent or early puberty stage, then we know that some types of exercise are better than others and some types of load are better than others. Now, the reason for that is that, as I was sort of talking about with that maturation of the musculoskeletal system, is we know that their bones, they may be longer and they may be getting taller, but their bones will be particularly in a period of particular weakness because the bone density hasn't happened yet. So you can imagine then that loading that skeletal system heavily through lots of jumping and landing and, lots of load-bearing exercise, whilst we know that load-bearing exercise is really good for bone, if the bone is not able to withstand it, we start to get that breakdown, right?
Yeah. So it's just getting that balance right, eh?
Yeah, I think you just got to be, so loading is more about the biological age of the athlete than it is about the chronological age. So we could have a 14-year-old girl who still has not started menstruating, that's on the really early spectrum of puberty, might be late developer, and then we can have a 14-year-old who's already been cycling for 18 months, who has 18 more months of bone mineral density, who has 18 more months of estrogen in the system to protect the skeletal tissue, who has 18 more months of an endocrine system. Do you know what I mean? So I know that doesn't really help, it may not help parents, but I think what you need to look at is my child, I guess if I wanted to talk about my own experience, my young daughter's 13. She started the early signs of puberty probably around 9, like pretty 9 or 10, pretty common age. But I think that she hasn't then moved into that next stage where the sex hormones are actually being produced in big proportions. So she's tall and she's very lean, but her skeletal system is not robust. So I have to be really careful about how much she does because her body doesn't tolerate it. And she will be one of the kids, and some of the parents on this call might be seeing that they will have their children will kind of complain about little aches and pains regularly and often. So she'll have a sore ankle one day and then she'll have a sore shin the next and a sore knee and because the skeletal system. So she is better off. And again, when we talk about courageous conversations, she's better off having days off in between. She's better off doing lots of different sports and not heaps of the same thing. And that's, again, because of her stage of growth and the stage of her hormone production. And that has a big effect on your bone and your soft tissue and your body systems. So hopefully that works.
So moving into, I guess, the next bit then is going what recovery looks like as well, and what really good recovery and how we can, what signs do we need to maybe think about, or what are some of the things that as parents they need to think about what recovery looks like?
Yeah, okay. I feel like there's so many questions, and I know people are probably sitting in the chat thinking, answer more questions about my load. And we can do some more at the end. But yeah, you're right. Like, next thing is to talk about recovery. And again, I guess what I'm trying to get across is a little bit of the depth around why it's important, because I think parents, we've all had some face value advice for a long time. I think a lot of people kind of know, but the reason that recovery is so important and vital, and good recovery, is because that's when the hormones work their magic. So people will often think that kids and kids and athletes in general are getting fitter when they're playing sport and they're training, but in actual fact, the only training that you're benefiting from is the training you're recovering from. So hormones actually go to work burrowing away and flicking on signals when we're sleeping and when we're resting. So if we're not giving young athletes and female athletes a chance to recover, those hormone networks just don't start to kick in. And so there's that down regulation. Now, remember, again, we know that recovery has to be supported with good nutrition. So recovery and nutrition plus training stimulus are the three big things, right? So we said that at the start. But essentially that is the gold is in the rest and recovery. And so that is why at a young age we say you must try and we really want young people to have at least one day off, and probably two, to be fair. If you get the recovery right, then what you'll start to see is, just on this slide, is you will get good performance. So it's about athletes can keep performing. They're getting better because the hormones are working to drive the adaptation to training. So performance gets better. They make some gains. They're enthusiastic about being there. They are more protected against injury and illness. So under recovery is one of our biggest signs of ill health or unbalanced health, and unbalanced health is one of our biggest drivers around injury and illness. So and then also we will see just a general mental wellness of people in terms with regards to sport. I'm saying, not mental health, but you will have athletes who have good mood, who are motivated to train, who want to be there, enthusiastic, can take in those directions and instructions and stuff. So that's how we kind of know that recovery is going well. So
we've just had a question really quickly come through. What does a day off look like? Like, is it literally a day off from sport training, or is it like, what does a day off, or is it a day off from school? What would a good rest day look like?
Yeah, again, like, I don't want to say it depends because it's the most frustrating answer. But if you go back to thinking about growth and development, I guess it kind of does. But if it was a young athlete, I would say a day off means a complete day off. Now, bearing in mind that doesn't necessarily mean not going for a little walk around town and going out for lunch and stuff, but it doesn't also mean that day off gets replaced with a family hike because they're not having a day of football practice. It does really mean a day off. And I think sometimes the gold is in, we'll often complain about teenagers being, lazy and lying around and stuff. But in actual fact, if their life is balanced and they are training and then they're recovering, it actually might look like recovery.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important. In terms of older athletes, whereby their musculoskeletal and endocrine systems are more developed, and a rest day might look a little bit more like an active rest day, a really light training. But again, the recovery should really be periodized. So it means that sometimes in your season, the recovery might not need to be so much, and at other times it needs to be a complete day off. And that's that kind of balance of knowing when to pull back. So and we're going to go into this in a while, just to sort of screen your children about whether they're looking like they're in balanced health. If you're seeing some of the signs of an unbalanced healthy athlete, then that's the time to kind of pull back and be more aggressive on that rest and recovery so that you get that positive adaptation. If you're feeling like you're not seeing those signs, it's in the early part of a season, it might mean that you don't have to be quite so aggressive. And young people, though, always be always push for more recovery, I guess.
I think, Andrea, if this is coming in the chat, is it a day off from school? I think if they're trying to pull a day off from school, they might be pulling a leg a bit there. So look, moving into the next kind of part, and we edged into it then as well, is going, well, how do we start having these conversations, advocating? What are the signs that we need to look out for? Maybe how do we start to have those conversations? Because there's a few in here, a few questions and a few comments going, geez, how do I talk to my coaches, to my kids' coaches and things like that? Or what do I need to be looking out for?
Yeah, sure. It's a hard one. And I think, when I talk to coaches as well, I'm really encouraging them to be courageous, because I think coaches, and if you're a parent on here who is a coach, I think sometimes you have to be a change maker. You have to be a bit of a leader. And if you see a child or an athlete struggling, I think having that ability to say to them, you deserve a break. I think you need a break. I don't need you tonight. We're going to take rotations of people having rest days. That would be great. That would be ideal. I'm just going to skip to a wee slide. I think that this is a wee slide where essentially you can go through a bit of a checklist of what you're looking for. Remembering that when we're looking at adolescents, we're looking at this concept of what they're doing, how they're recovering, and what they're eating. So then we look at these signs that those three things might not be in good balance, I guess. So for female athletes, it's about checking in on menstruation. And as parents, I'd really encourage just kind of knowing those sort of four things we talked about. Do they have one? Is it regular? Are they taking hormonal contraception? It might just be needing to be more aware of that. If they are taking contraception that affects ovulation, you need to be even more aware of these other 5 categories. Nutrition, keeping an eye on, the most important thing is keeping an eye on young females who are beginning to show signs of disordered eating practices, and that's skipping particular food groups or only using food as a reward. The other things is, as parents, is really supporting a lot of food going with them. So planning and preparing. And body image issues, obviously, and social media. So those sorts of things, again, another big topic. Sleep. So again, all the concepts around sleep hygiene are actually really important, obviously, because 8 hours of sleep is what a young athlete needs to reduce their injury and illness risk. So if they get less than 8 hours of sleep, they are 1.8 times more likely to get injured or ill. And it has a massive effect on mental health and the ability to recover. So remembering that that's when our hormones are doing their best work. So that's vitally important. And the hours before midnight are really important as well. So as parents, it's just continuing to try and I guess, again, just trying to come at it from a health angle and a performance angle rather than a parental angle that we often come at it from. I think I was going to say something else, but I can't remember. Injury and illness. So one of the big things as a physio for female athletes is keeping an eye on bone health. So bone is really, really vital in females because we are at greater risk of bone mineral density issues and osteoporosis. If your child is having unexplained or pain in bones that does not come from a particular injury, so it's just a sort of an onset that comes with training, it doesn't go away, it's painful at rest, we want to be looking into those things, and we want to be considering all the other things that go with it, so the menstruation, nutrition and sleep, and get a physio to check it over. If if they have a history of bone injury, they're more likely to get another one. And also this other concept of getting injured and ill in quite quick succession, which is called the injury illness cascade. How motivated are they about training? Has it changed recently? Is there big loads, that have, have they changed into a higher performance kind of area? Those sorts of things. And really their mood in and around their sport. Do they want to go? Do they appear to be stressed about it? Are they concerned? Those sorts of things. And then again, when we're talking about those conversations, I think, again, using from personal experience, it's talking about looking at the big picture of the week and kind of looking at the state of your child and then thinking, where, if anywhere, could I have a courageous conversation, or where could I see there being a reasonable place where I could give my child a break. And so for me, it was looking at a couple of early morning training sessions that seemed to be a bit too much with relevance to the age of the child and the growth and the maturation. And it was also cutting into sleeping time and adding anxiety. And so just having a conversation back with school about saying, hey, actually at the moment they're really struggling with just the general aspects of school. I feel like this is cutting into their sleep time. Is it compulsory to go to both of them? Could we negotiate one of them? And that for me was, actually turned out to be easy conversation. And sometimes, remember, you might only have to do it once. You might only have to do it once every 3 months. You might only have to do it, once a term. You might just be getting that relief for your child. And it may not have to be every week. If it is every week, there's probably a problem. There's probably a bigger problem. And so here's the key messages really, is looking at, again, and with the Balance is Better concept, what is success? And our success should look like happy, healthy, young people who want to keep playing sport. Like that should really be what we're aiming for. Progress is that our females feel supported and that they're starting to grow these individual strengths and get all the good benefits from sport, and that we're having healthy athletes. Like that's my big passion, is we have healthy athletes who can keep that kind of consistency of training where they're not losing time to sport. And so what you can do is really plan and prepare. You want to be able to identify when things are maybe going wrong, advocate for your children, and then just take some action around some simple steps.
Holy moly,
That's just the surface.
It's just the surface. Man, I'm really conscious of time, and I know that there are so many questions that maybe we haven't got to. I really hope that we're able to answer a whole load of stuff. The key takeaways for me, and I think there are two really important things. Menstruation builds health, health builds performance. That's sort of the one that stuck with me, and I hope that there were some other critical key messages that stuck with other people as well. Look, I know there's some stuff we haven't got to. We will take away all of these questions and we will look at how we can address some of these things. Yes, would love to do more webinars in this area. Low nutrition cycle. Thank you, John. I totally agree. Opportunity to do more in this space. So look, Kylie, really appreciate you giving us your time today. Really appreciate your expertise and your passion for this space. And it's been an absolute pleasure over the last couple of weeks talking to you and building this webinar with you as well. Thank you so very much. To everyone on the call, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It has been wonderful to have you all as part of this conversation. And safe to say that our young women, our wahine, are in really good hands with all of the engaged conversation that we've had as part of this chat. Look, I'm going to close this out with our karakia. So, tu taua mai runga, tu taua mai raro, tu taua mai roto, tu taua mai waho, kia tau ai te mauri tū, kia tau ai te mauri ora, tū whakamaua, kia tina, haumie, huie, taekie. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you all so much. Kylie, it has been wonderful. Have a lovely rest of your evening, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, team. Ka kite.